think it's fair to say that GitHub won. GitLab exists, and I'm thankful that it does. There's a couple other competitors here and there, and way back when, SourceForge was a thing. But what led to GitHub winning? How is it that it's become as dominant as it is, and how did they actually manage to dethrone something as popular as SourceForge? This is a story I've wanted to tell for a while, and thankfully, channel sponsor Graphite took the time to do the deep dive and then decided to pay me to talk about it. So this is a sponsored video, although we're not really talking about the sponsor that much because, again, the focus is on GitHub and how they replace SourceForge. That said, I'll be sure to plug Graphite and why I like them at some point in the video, so keep an eye out for that. Definitely worth checking out the product. I do love it. We're not here for that. We're here for GitHub, and I promise you, Graphite is within the most experienced people to talk about this thing. So without further ado, how GitHub replaced SourceForge as the dominant code hosting platform. Thank you again to Greg for this. Greg also wrote the Why Facebook Uses Git article that I loved so much way back. And just to make sure it's clear, Graphite isn't an alternative to GitHub. It's actually built on top of GitHub. So you're just signing into it and using the repos you already have. So it's not like you have to leave everything else behind. It's not like your whole team has to make this big move over to Graphite. It's a thing you can absolutely incrementally adopt and try out for some projects, not all of them. But I love it. Highly recommend it. You should consider checking it out. I've been writing code since high school. I have a faint memory of creating an Android game with friends using Tortoise SVN to share code. God damn it, Tortoise. That's a name I have not heard in a very long time. They're still updating it? Good for them, but Jesus. At college, I learned to clone GitHub repos to access computer science homework assignments. Later, during internships, I joined the ranks using GitHub to review and merge pull requests. Most developers who came to professional age during the last decade probably had a similar experience to me. I certainly am in that group. GitHub is synonymous with source code and code changes, whether with open source projects or on private companies and teams. I will say I'm a bit terrified that people seem to mistake Git and GitHub now. I've absolutely noticed this is almost as bad as like Java and JavaScript for new devs, where a new dev will be working on web stuff and they'll be like, yeah, I'm learning Java. No, you're not. You're learning JavaScript. And people will be like, yeah, I'm learning GitHub. I use it all the time. It's like, do you mean Git or GitHub? And I've also seen people who thought they knew Git that use GitHub to like drag and drop things in the browser and don't actually use Git at all. So yeah, Git and GitHub are different and people should learn them separately. They don't, but that's just reality. And the popularity of GitHub as a tool has allowed them to largely take the Git brand, which is kind of hilarious when you remember that Git was made by Linus Torvalds, who made Linux, and GitHub is owned by Microsoft, who makes Windows. All fun ironies aside, let's dive in. One more fun thing here on the open source or private company teams. I was so surprised when I got to Twitch, knowing Twitch was owned by Amazon and knowing Amazon had an absolute mess of a source control system, to see that Twitch was just using GitHub. I had never seen GitHub Enterprise before. I had heard it might exist, but just not worked at a company with it. It was still new enough to the industry back in 2016 that it was mind-blowing to me to see the tool I'd been using for all my open source stuff just being available for a company to use too, and not having to learn a new thing to use Git in the workplace. It was awesome. It was really cool. So yeah, you'd be amazed how many companies are just using GitHub Enterprise now. It's like, I wouldn't say most dev companies, but close to 50%, if not more at this point. Like over 90% of Fortune 100 companies use GitHub. Yeah, I guess it is more than half in the end. You get the point. Anyways, it's easy to take the GitHub ubiquity for granted, but how did things get this way? I asked my teammate David how he came to discover GitHub. He's who's been coding a decade longer than I have, and he's lived through the professional transition. This is, again, what I love so much about Greg. He's doing these deep dives, like finding the right person or set of people to talk about these things with. In this case, it's just an older dev. That older dev happens to be a big nerd about version control, but in the article about Facebook stuff, he found all the old Facebook employees who made the decisions around not using Git there and got a really good history lesson that he could then share with us. So once again, huge shout out to Greg. These articles are so good. Through the 2000s, he recounted using SVN at programming jobs. He would download software from SourceForge, but considered the UI to be utilitarian and crappy. Eventually, he found himself navigating GitHub more and more often to find docs and download open source tools such as Rails. Rails is one of the first big GitHub projects for sure. I remember seeing it on GitHub and be like, wow, this is where things are hosted now. This is so much less bad. This led to him reading up about Git and eventually using a Git to SVN translator at work. Git to SVN translator. There's no better way to date yourself and also prove you're trying than using a Git to SVN converter. Jesus Christ. But even up until 2010, many companies were still hosting code on SVN, and it wasn't until years later that most private organizations migrated fully to Git. Yep. David's anecdote only piqued my interest further. How did GitHub enter the market? What existed before, and what gap did they fill? Quick note about how cool Graphite is. And again, these articles are only possible because of Graphite and also paying me to do it. Shout out to them. We'll talk about stack diffs in a bit. We'll get there though. I will say Graphite has made using GitHub and dealing with source control significantly better and takes a lot of the fun benefits from other solutions. The world before GitHub. 4 years before GitHub was founded, in 2004, Linus created Git. While many folks still use SVN, Git was growing rapidly in popularity as a distributed version control system. It came with compelling value. Unlike prior tools like CVS and SVN, Git users could host entire copies of source code on their own computers without needing to communicate to a centralized server. Folks could update code, even offline, as well as share copies with one another without the approval or hosting costs from a centrally managed source. And while branching code in SVN required duplicating the entire repository, creating branches in Git was fast and cheap. I don't think a lot of y'all understand just how painful SVN was. The idea of like sharing a repo with people where anyone could change anything at any time, not fun in the slightest. You had to like check out individual files instead of making a branch and then merging it later. Not fun. Emily said that she discovered Git in 2007 and spent an hour selling her boss on why they should switch to it immediately. That's huge. These are the right types of initiatives, by the way. Like if you're at a company that has some things that are behind, like let's say you're just starting to explore TypeScript. Let's say you're writing all of your fetch calls yourself using crappy use effects. Even as a junior dev, you can move your company over to something like React Query or help with the efforts to move to TypeScript or update your React version. All those types of things helped me level up a ton when I was early at Twitch, especially when I was getting into the web dev stuff, because I did not start Twitch as a web dev at all. But those types of efforts to like convince the team to try the new thing and then pushing, like having just the energy and inertia you bring as a new dev is super underrated. And these types of stories are what it's really good for. As one can imagine, these improvements led to an explosion of creative development in the open source community. Git was custom built for distributed and democratized development, and it spread virally. Despite its advantages, however, Git was slower to catch on in corporate code bases, which remained reasonably well served by private, centrally managed SVN servers with legacy workflows. Skip forward 4 years to 2008. Open source projects like Rails were following Linux, and they were starting to adopt Git. Private organizations continued using SVN and Perforce servers to centrally manage source code. Open source software was distributed primarily on SourceForge, later Google Code, or rarely alternatives like personally hosted servers. God, Google Code. Things I would prefer to never have to think about again. SourceForge, despite its dominance, left much to be desired. For one, the site didn't offer Git support until 2009, over a year after GitHub was created, and it quickly had climbed to 100,000 users at that point. 100K users doesn't sound like much now, especially when you consider that roughly 1 million people watch my channel every month. But in 2009, 100K people on GitHub was nuts. And that's why back in the day, having 1,000 stars on GitHub was unbelievable. But the differences ran deeper than the tech. Today, when we think of online code hosting, we think of a website that you can visit to browse the code, look at issues, and contributors all seamlessly. That was not the SourceForge experience. To be fair, it still isn't the SourceForge experience, but at the time it wasn't either. Rather, it and alternatives like Google Code focused on software distribution to end users, not code collaboration. Yep. This tweet broke me. There's been a couple posts like this. I've seen them here and there. I'm sorry I have to say this, but GitHub needs a big red download button. I'm not throwing on some programming socks and looking through the changelog. I need the thing now so I can move on with life. Do you know how easy it is to download something on GitHub? Here's one of my favorite examples, Lossless Cut, which I use heavily. Scroll down, click releases. Any of these buttons will do it. Click that, or that. Any of these three bring you to releases. And now I have all of the things I might want to download. If you're not a coder, this might be a little bit harder. Like the one painful thing here is since there's a show all, the Windows option isn't visible until you click that, and then the Windows version's available. Not the biggest deal, but as this article has made it very clear, as it should, GitHub's for devs. SourceForge was for end users, not for collaborating with code. GitHub's for developers to collaborate. The one thing I really wish they would do is give an option in a repo to put the README up higher, because this repo has all of these top-level files, and you have to scroll quite a bit before you can even get to the README. You have to scroll a bit more because of how it's formatted before you learn anything about how to install. Thankfully, this app's actually in the Mac App Store and the Microsoft Store for the dumbasses that don't know how to find the button. But for everyone else, yeah, just learn GitHub. It's not that hard. But yes, GitHub's optimization for devs meant that they won all the devs and they won them very, very quickly. SourceForge lost all the devs because, again, SourceForge wasn't building for devs. They were building a place to put your stuff as a dev when it was done. GitHub was so much better for devs that they just won. As this article says, they solved half the puzzle by aggregating the distribution of open source projects, but they offered little in the form of comments, code browsing, change reviews, and other modern table stakes features. It gets worse, though. Creating and managing repos in SourceForge was painful. For one, the site required an application and a human approval to create a new repo. Furthermore, private repos were never supported, meaning the site was never useful for closed source hosting. Leaving comments and issues on projects was unintuitive, and forking was an uncommon practice. Imagine an open source platform that doesn't really support forking. Ugh. If you wanted to contribute to a project, the most common way was to generate a patch and then send it over the project's mailing server, rather than forking it and opening a pull request back to the project. How insane is that? The best way to get changes in a repo was to generate a patch file and then email them about it. Things have improved so much. You new devs don't know how bad things were. Learning about SourceForge 20 years later, I'm struck by how similar it sounds to the current Apple App Store. In that light, the gap in the market that GitHub could fill is much clearer. Yes, SourceForge was so focused on making it easier for a non-dev to install someone else's open source thing that it sucked for devs, but they were much more leaning the App Store side of things for sure. The incumbents, SourceForge and Google Code. Check out SourceForge's landing page from back in 2008. I want to take a look at this. This is going to hurt me. It's going to hurt so deep. That's it? That's all it'll load? That's fine. I love the crappy gradient on the title bars and like the mirroring there. That like reflection effect, everything had it back in the day. This is nostalgic as fuck. Oh, the good old days. Honestly, like the biggest SourceForge selling point at the time is that it was free and nothing else was. They made it free with ads, but you get the idea. Yeah, what do we notice when we look at it? Proud claims about being the largest open source focused site on the web. Download numbers and highlighted projects, new software version releases, even an advertisement on the right column. But it has no mention of Git, no focus on user profiles, and no private repos. The focus is on distribution, not collaboration. Yep. See all this? It's just trying to show off the download button primarily. Examples of a repo on SourceForge. This is an example of a repo on SourceForge. Notice how the main call to action is the download button rather than a clone button? I will say on GitHub, like, how often are you in a repo and you actually click the fork button here? I feel like that's relatively uncommon, and having that be a higher level thing than actually downloading the code or using the project, it feels kind of weird to me. I understand why, but the hierarchy of UI in GitHub is kind of a mess. Also, like the watch button, why is that right there? Who the fuck actually clicks this button? This repo has 3.7 thousand stars, and one of the top actions here has only been used 13 times. GitHub's a weird platform, man. It's still so much better than SourceForge, but GitHub's UI feels like it needs to be rethought. But people are scared to because it's so established now. But man, the UX on GitHub is so dated. But even then, like when you see how dated SourceForge is, it makes sense. People saying they don't even know what Watch does, like, yeah, that's the issue. No one actually fucking uses those things, but it's right there. Ugh. Anyways, code.google.com was incrementally better than SourceForge. The site focused on making it easy to host code and documentation as well, all for free. It leveraged Google's great search acumen for discovery and offered thoughtful documentation for devs looking to learn. But critically, it lacked social and collaborative features that would later prove to be super powerful for open source projects. That's things like issues, things like pull requests, all these features. Like the pull request workflow we know today was largely invented by GitHub as an alternative to emailing diffs. Lastly, while it launched with SVN support, Google Code didn't add support for Git hosting until 2011, complete with a sassy titled Wired article. Google Code finally adds Git support. It's been a long time, but Google Code's finally added support for the wildly popular Git version control. Yep. It's also funny because Android was all built on top of Git, and Google didn't support it for a while, so they couldn't put Android on Google Code. Good times. Good times. But now to the invention of GitHub, thing we're all here for. One evening in 2008, Tom Preston Werner and Chris Wadsworth met for a drink at an SF Sports bar after a Rails meetup. Yes, GitHub came from the Rails community like hardcore. And yes, Rails existed before GitHub did, and it's all built on Ruby on Rails. The Rails community was starting to use Git more and more, but there was no central website like SourceForge for hosting Git repos. Moreover, social networks were clearly taking off, but no such social network existed for devs like them who were working on open source projects. You have no idea how much time we had to spend in fucking crappy IRC chat rooms at the time. It was rough. Git had made collaborative software development much easier than it ever had been before, and sites like SourceForge helped distribute version releases, but no site served as a home for collaboration. What if anyone could host source code, discuss issues, and request maintainers to pull in forked changes, all backed with profile pages and comment feeds like Facebook? This might sound silly, but do you know how revolutionary it was to have a profile picture and a thing somebody could click to see what other stuff you work on? That was not a thing at all at the time. And it was a massive change to know if the person making contribution is even worth considering or not when you have big, important projects. Oh, night and day difference. The soon-to-be GitHub co-founders began hacking on the first version of GitHub as a weekend project. They developed the bare bones of GitHub. Obviously, they used Rails. They did it over the weekend until it was complete enough to work at Chris's day job. Throughout daily dogfooding, they worked out the kinks and fixed any blocking feature gaps. There's a quote from Chris. GitHub, the company, had sort of sprung up from the side project, so we never had any big vision or dreams or aspirations. We just wanted to work on something cool. They succeeded. DHH was one of the first profiles on GitHub. This is such a crazy... GitHub's branding originally was social coding. It's just funny when you think about it now, but at the time, it made perfect sense. The Ruby on Rails creator was also an early user of GitHub, helping to skyrocket the site's early popularity. This is the beautiful GitHub site back in 2008. Oh man, I love that. Git repository hosting, no longer a pain in the ass. How many billions of dollars did they get bought for? $7.5 billion 10 years later. They went from no longer a pain in the ass as their like subtitle to $7.5 billion in 10 years. Not bad if I do say so myself. Wait, no, that's actually interesting too. I forgot it was that late because as I said, Twitch was using GitHub Enterprise when I joined, which meant that we were using it before Microsoft owned it, which is kind of crazy to think about. Was that really 2018? Yeah, that's wild. I would have sworn that was longer ago. Good to know. Back to the article though, because finally, a code repository that works as well as you do. God, look at that old GitHub UI. Oh, the news feed, the source browser. Good times. They got all these quotes. They got the DHH. Killer apps make or break any platform. With GitHub, I think the GitHub just scored one. What's amazing about GitHub is how it really brings the social aspect into play. You've probably heard this at least 12 times last week, but GitHub is totally badass. Yep, it was so much better than anything else that innovation almost stopped as a result. GitHub's original logo included social code hosting as their H1 brand promise, which read, GitHub repository hosting no longer a pain in the ass. Yep, I love that he's calling out the same things. There could be no confusion. GitHub launched with two core value adds, social networking features and the ability to host a Git repo online. No other site competed on these terms. Absolutely. Project and developer newsfeed. Yep, you have the newsfeed, you have the new code tab, which funny enough doesn't look that different. Still has the fork and the watch button way too high up. I don't think they had stars yet, though. Yeah, this is pre-stars. The source code browser for easily viewing your code at any version and on any branch or tag. This was revolutionary. Being able to look at different branches on a project, seeing how others are working on different things and looking at the Git history and all of that inside of the browser was actually fucking revolutionary. Public dev profiles. You can see what other devs are working on and how many commits they've made. Here's all those quotes there too. Anyways, the rapid growth. Because man, did GitHub blow up. It happened fast. The fact that I keep accidentally saying GitHub when I read Git says everything. Yeah, you're not wrong. After dogfooding the MVP, the GitHub co-founders launched a free beta to friends for hosting public repos. GitHub's growth in the open source community was explosive, demonstrating a great product market fit. It was quickly adopted and enforced by the Rails project, meaning anyone wanting to use Ruby on Rails had to interact with GitHub. That's how folks like my teammate David first learned about GitHub as well as Git. In its first year, GitHub grew to 46,000 public repos. The next year, it had 90,000 repos and 100K users. And then in the third year, the number was over 1 million repos. And by 2011, GitHub had surpassed SourceForge and Google Code in scale. Pretty crazy to do that in 3 years, but also crazy to think that even as early as 2010, those other solutions were still that much more popular. And it took until 2011 before GitHub was the obvious winner. I would have guessed it was a little quicker than that, but all checks out. First 12 months was $1 million of revenue. The next year was $3 million and then $9 million. That 3xing every year is kind of nuts. Despite the rapid early growth, the three founders remained frugal and bootstrapped. They worked to generate revenue quickly. Rather than focusing on ads like SourceForge had, or enterprise sales like Perforce did, the GitHub founders quickly began selling individual tier subscriptions for hosting private repos. Who remembers this? Who in chat? I want to see ones in chat for people who are paying the $5 a month for private repos on GitHub. I should be seeing a lot of ones drop in a second here, or I'm going to feel real fucking old. Not as many as I was hoping, enough that I feel a little better. But back in the day, before the Microsoft acquisition, you had to pay to be a GitHub Pro user to have private repos. You had to spend money or be a student and get like the free thing for it to have private repos. And then GitHub got bought by Microsoft, and all of a sudden they let everything be free. They killed that because they didn't need the money anymore. But it was crazy to think like you couldn't make a private repo without spending money before. And people would use Bitbucket instead just to have private repos, which is crazy. Multiple people have said that. Absolutely nuts. The model was easy to understand, self-serve, and somewhat original in the space compared to other hosting products and social network sites. Not only did Google Code and SourceForge not host Git repos, but they also had no option for private code hosting at all. Outside of GitHub, the only option for private repository hosting was running a personally managed server. Do you know how revolutionary this was? To have a way to have a private GitHub repository, just a place that is your source code that you're working on with other people. Having Git is your way of collaborating without having to give the code out for free. No one had that at the time. And it was $5 a month to do things the right business way, having all of your stuff locked down. Nothing else like it had existed before. And then it started to take over in enterprise as well because the DX was just so much better. Beyond quick revenue from subscriptions, the GitHub co-founders found alternative ways of making and saving money. They experimented with alternative revenue streams like one-off ad spots, merch store, Git training services, and even a jobs board. To keep business costs as low as they could, they partnered with Engine Yard and then later Rackspace, offering footer advertising in return for free hosting. The free hosting for a footer is the classic. Still got that to this day with the Powered by Vercel at the bottom of the Create T3 stack site. Hosting provided by Engine Yard. Love that high-res JPEG there. In 2009, GitHub launched a self-hosted version that enabled larger enterprises to run GitHub. I did not know they had that the second year they existed. That was real early. In 2009, offer self-hosting. Jesus. Instead of using SVN servers or products like Perforce, engineers could use their newfound Git tooling for both open source as well as closed source dev. A GitHub plan for organizations and teams launched in 2010, further pushing into the private market for code hosting and change collaboration. And by 2011, they had rebranded GitHub Fi into a formal enterprise server product. I've never seen the name GitHub Fi before. I just can't stop thinking of Google Fi. That's so confusing. Ugh. From Chris, our GitHub Enterprise product was created to help us spread GitHub to more people. So whether you're stuck behind a firewall or you have full access to the web, we want to make sure GitHub works for you. Makes sense. Obviously, also, enterprises give you a lot more money. By innovating on traditional code hosting business models, GitHub earned enough money to scale its team and iterate on the product experience further than any previous product. That's another big thing. Because they had this early advantage and they had the small team and they were using modern tools like Rails to build. I know modern tools like Rails sounds crazy now, but at the time it was even crazier. Rails, their small team, their actual income sources, and their lack of reliance on things like ads let them iterate and make massive changes way quicker than anybody else. Since then, I think that's changed and somebody else could meaningfully disrupt GitHub, but it would take a lot of effort to do it. Back to the article. But the deep revenue focus and bootstrap growth wasn't just a choice. VC investment wasn't an option for the co-founders. Up until 2010, companies making developer tools failed to attract any significant investment. That's a crazy thought because right now dev tools are the thing that raise. But at the time, dev tools didn't make money as far as VCs cared, so they would not be able to raise anything at all. Even though the tools companies were starting to see exits, such as the 2013 Facebook acquisition of Parse, the maker of tools for mobile apps, the reported $80 million was considered on the low side. For some, developer tools would always remain a venture capital dead zone. That's just so wild to read now. So wild. It took investment traction from Heroku, Atlassian, Stripe, Twilio, and SendGrid to help open up the market. Only after 6 years did GitHub raise investment from a bold Andreessen Horowitz, $100 million for what was marketed as the largest Series A ever. God, $100 million being the largest Series A ever is so crazy. Things have changed so much. So much. Wild. But who didn't adopt GitHub? Because I still to this day certainly see SourceForge links here and there. Google never adopted GitHub internally. Throughout the 2000s, they used Perforce and later developed a custom version control system named Piper. Not only did Google have uniquely advanced version control tooling, but to my knowledge, they also invented web-based code reviews. Their early code review dashboard from 2004 took inspiration from Gmail and it set a gold standard for corporate software development workflows. They had no immediate need for Git and GitHub. I haven't seen this. Oh, that's sound. Sorry. This is a talk from 2004. What is code review? Benefits of code review. This is so wild. Do they have pictures of what this UI looks like? I really want to see it. That's nuts. That's so crazy. It looks so much like Gmail. That's hilarious. A little bit of a quick history lesson. Gmail was one of the first big Ajax-based web interfaces. Up until Ajax, which is the idea that JavaScript can request more data after the page loaded and do things like a button that interacts and gets more data. Because before, JavaScript could run in the browser, but to get data, you had to load a new page. Ajax meant you could request things like JSON or HTML from a server on the page and get changes. So you could click a button and have new content come in. And one of the first, arguably almost certainly the first big Ajax-built app was Gmail, which was crazy because at the time when you used an email in the browser, you'd click the button and it would have to load a whole new web page and send you to it and then display that info. With Gmail, you could click it and it would just open up in line because it's only fetching that little bit of additional data and then rendering it with the JavaScript, which now is just how websites work, but was invented largely by like the Gmail team early on. And it changed how we do development forever. So it's not too surprising to me that they built something for code around the same time using that tech. But it's way crazier to me they never thought to share it because they could have made GitHub years before GitHub. But they had it internally. And this is a thing I've heard a lot at Google where they solve a problem they have internally and then just never bother sharing that solution. And then they'll build other solutions for the public that they don't even use internally. Kind of nuts. Facebook also never adopted GitHub though. The Facebook story here is kind of nuts. Around 2010, Facebook's Evan Priestley developed Phabricator in 2010, a year before GitHub formally launched their enterprise self-hosting. Even if GitHub's offering had been available, it's likely Facebook would have still opted to develop their own tooling to better integrate with tailored internal solutions and to help handle monorepo scales that even raw Git struggled to keep up with. Yeah, Git did not handle big repos well at all at the time. It took a lot of investment from Microsoft to fix that. What's more, Facebook moved off of Git to Mercurial, which GitHub never developed formal support for, as it shouldn't have. And this story of Facebook using Mercurial is nuts. I have a whole video about it if you want to check that out. But we're not here to talk about Mercurial, we're talking about GitHub. It's also important to note the unicorn companies, which if you don't know, a unicorn's a company that ends up worth $1 billion. One of the first unicorns that mattered in the modern dev world was Airbnb. And a lot of companies like them adopted GitHub very early on. Other notable companies such as Uber and Pinterest self-hosted and forked Phabricator. While I'm not certain, I suspect those who chose Phabricator did so because 1, it was still the best self-hostable and open source control service, and 2, they were filled with ex-Facebookers missing their former toolchain. Yep, this happened a lot. GitLab launched in 2011 and counterpositioned against GitHub by focusing on being a complete DevOps platform rather than just social coding. This is something GitLab doesn't get enough credit for. They really pushed and pioneered on modern CI/CD stuff. Like they were the first place to host your source code that would also run builds, integration tests, deployments, all of those things. And that was revolutionary. GitHub then tried to clone it, built some really cool stuff, then got acquired by Microsoft and deprecated most of the cool stuff in favor of boring Azure stuff. But that's a long rant for another day. Let me know if you want to hear that one. But yeah, as they said here, GitLab tagged onto the booming trend in DevOps and leaned heavily on CI and CD to gain market share in some major tech companies, including things like NVIDIA. Working on Graphite in 2024, I speak with hundreds, if not thousands, of high-tech engineering teams. It is exceedingly rare that I hear about companies that don't use GitHub. Stack Overflow's 2022 survey claims that GitHub's professional market share is only double GitLab's. But in practice, I'd anecdotally say that 95% of modern tech companies are probably using GitHub, and only a handful of those companies are self-hosting the GitHub Enterprise. That's actually very interesting that such a small percentage of them are bothering with GitHub Enterprise. The remaining few either use GitLab, Phabricator, or Gerrit, or have custom-built an in-house code hosting platform. Far too many people have done that. The future of GitHub and code hosting. Linus Torvalds, the original developer of the Git software, has highly praised GitHub by stating, "The hosting of GitHub is excellent. They've done a good job at that. I think GitHub should be commended enormously for making open source project hosting so easy." However, he also sharply critiqued the implementation of GitHub's merging interface, stating that, quote, "Git comes with a nice pull request generation module, but GitHub instead decided to replace it with their own totally inferior version. As a result, I consider GitHub useless for these kinds of things. It's fine for hosting, but the pull requests and online commit editing, those are just pure garbage." And honestly, to this day, the code review stuff was revolutionary, but it's not good. GitHub code reviews are still rough. It's such a bad UI. I actually have a better time reviewing code on my phone than on the GitHub site because the mobile app's a from scratch rewrite, so it's a little more functional. That said, I'm going to take the opportunity to plug Graphite. Graphite's trying to solve those types of problems. Never wait for a code review again. So, the magic of Graphite is that they've built an abstraction on top of GitHub that makes a lot of things a lot less miserable. So if we look here, I'm in the T3 open source repo, which I have to get on the free open source plan. By the way, if you're open source or a startup, they offer Graphite for free, which is really, really nice. But man, things like code reviews in here are just so much better. Like the UI doesn't suck. It lets you leave comments in these things with these quick buttons. It shows you what's actually changed or not changed. The view button actually fucking works. It's just so much better. And also, if people have made a bunch of changes on a given thing, you have different versions of this same thing. And if I want to just compare what's changed from version 3 to 6, now I'm just comparing version 3 to 6 instead. It's so nice. I really like using Graphite, even if just for the code reviewer. But obviously their CLI, their way of building things, everything else is really nice. If you want GitHub to feel a little bit more modern and a little bit less painful, Graphite's almost certainly the way to do it. You got a lot of big companies using it. We're using it a bunch too. It's so nice. And man, don't get me started on stack diffs. If you've ever had that wonderful issue where you have a PR, you're waiting for somebody to merge it, and now you're working on another PR based on that one, and then that first one merges, but the second one's still open, and then everything falls apart. Stack diffs just solve that. It makes it so much easier to stack changes on top of changes and then approve them individually or as a set, and then have it all merge in once all of it is approved. The idea of stacking your changes is somewhere between a commit and a pull request. But that new unit that fits between there is really, really nice. And if you haven't tried it before, it will break your brain for a bit. And to really see the benefits, you need to use it with a team. But if you're on a fast-moving team trying to push Git to its limits, stacking will help a ton. And I highly recommend checking out Graphite for that. End of the sponsor plug. Back to the article. So what's the future of code hosting? In Clay's famous book, The Innovator's Dilemma, Clay argues that each innovative products often start as an integrated solution. I would argue that GitHub and GitLab are examples of integrated offerings, offering a one-stop shop for teams looking to manage their source code. I would agree. But then once the space evolves, being the all-in-one is no longer the best way to go to market. You need to integrate in what people are expecting and already use. Like making a new email provider would be miserable if you don't support Gmail in some way. Making a new Photoshop competitor would be miserable if you don't support Photoshop files. Like you have to play into the existing standards. Clay argued that as the market matures, solutions become specialized and modular. Yep, beat me to it. Pre-read. We've already seen this begin to happen in a few areas of social coding. Things like Jira and Linear, which offer module issue tracking, while Jenkins and BuildKite offer modular CI solutions. GitHub was the original Git repo hosting, but in time, Bitbucket, AWS Code Commit, and others started to offer the same solution. GitHub now offers an integrated merge queue, but more specialized offerings exist from companies like Mergify, Aviator, Trunk, and even Graphite. GitHub maintains their monopoly over open source code due to a strong network effect, as well as product features like forking, form-style comments, and moderation that lends themselves fantastically to open source development. Closed source repos originally adopted GitHub due to their specialization in Git hosting. Again, GitHub was the only option for a closed source Git repo for a long time, which is kind of nuts. But now, obviously, that's a common capability. It's basically a commodity at this point. GitHub's social features are nearly useless at private companies, where discussions happen over things like Slack, Notion, Linear, and Zoom. Half agree. I still think code review is kind of a social feature and is really, really nice. And if you're a company that also has open source code, syncing between Linear and GitHub is its own cottage industry now. I believe the future involves a bifurcation between dev tools for open source as well as dev tools for closed source. Interesting. So open source and closed source are going to have different tools in the future. Interesting hypothesis. Open source collaboration needs discussions, profiles, moderation, forking, and discovery. Closed source collaboration needs code changes to be reviewed in hours, not days. It needs trunk-based workflows, merge queues, emergency procedures, as well as CI/CD coordination. There's overlap in both cases, but I believe over time, the world will further specialize in different solutions for the different use cases. Interesting. I do not fully agree. I think that the needs of open source devs are so great that they will continue innovating at a rapid pace. And even if you made something better for closed source devs right now, the open source community has a high chance of one-upping that quickly. On top of that, the best closed source devs The ones that work at companies that have a bunch of private code, they also work on open source stuff. If you have a big enough difference between how they work on the closed source stuff at work and the open source stuff for fun, they're just going to be annoyed at the one that they're using at work. So that's my one hesitation is the best devs are going to want to use the same tools for both, and open source will continue to innovate faster, not just because like there's more devs, but very importantly, those devs have greater needs because they're dealing with much higher throughputs of people and contributions and all these other things. We've already seen specialized solutions from Facebook and Google. By evolving their source control systems independently from GitHub's open source constraints, they've created powerful patterns like Google's PR inbox and Facebook's stack diffs. Man, stack diffs are so good. I'd like for modularization to progress to a point where every engineer can pick how they'd like to host their source code, completely independently of the tools they'd like to use to actually change the said source code. We've already seen this in other facets of dev, such as how developers are free to use their preferred IDE or their preferred cloud hosting provider. Yet we still all use VS Code and AWS. Tisk tisk. You know what? I would bet that VS Code's prevalence is probably comparable to GitHub's at this point. And I'd be surprised if there weren't just as many companies on AWS as there were on GitHub. Like those numbers feel very similar to me. I could be wrong, but that's my gut feel. GitHub earned their monopoly fair and square by better specializing into code hosting and social coding. But those aren't the end of the story. One day in the future, I hope developers have 5 viable options of where to host, not just one. Disclaimer. I'm young enough to not have been professionally coding before GitHub. Much of the information here is cobbled together from online sources. Obviously, same deal with me. The full timeline. SourceForge was 99. I was 4 years old when SourceForge dropped. That's nuts. CVS and SVN for version control, pretty popular. Linus created Git in 2004. GitHub's 4 years after Git was made. It took that long for Git to have a platform that really made sense for it, which is kind of nuts. SourceForge tried catching up a year later, but it was too late, especially since GitHub had the self-hosting version laying the groundwork for enterprise. Facebook developed Fabricator the next year. GitLab came out a year after that. GitHub actually launched enterprise in 2012. Google Code shut down in 2016, again proving that GitHub had won. GitHub added Actions in 2018. They were doing things like Actions before, but then when Microsoft bought them, they rebuilt Actions to basically just be an Azure thing, as I mentioned before. Let me know if that should be a full video. And then Fabricator announcing that they're no longer being actively maintained in 2021. What an article. That was a phenomenal read. Once again, huge shout out to Craig and my friends over at Graphite for making this one possible. Let me know what you think in the comments. And until next time, peace nerds.